Hello, everyone. I'm Dominique.
And I'm Christina, and we are the Connected in Glass podcast.
Every week, we will feature interviews with glass artists who speak to their creative processes and overcoming challenges.
These conversations are real and raw. We hope that by sharing these stories, you're able to find some connection and know that you're not alone. We just wanted to take a moment to thank you for listening to our podcast. We're super passionate about this project and work for hours every week to bring you this content. So if you'd like to help support us, please consider becoming a patron at patreon.com/connectedinglass. Also, please consider joining our Facebook group, Connected in Glass Community, where we continue the conversations from these episodes. We'd love to hear from you. This episode of Connected in Glass is sponsored by Diddy Clips. Diddy Clips has changed the way we film our glassblowing videos, and we're proud to be working with them. Today, we're interviewing Robert DuGrenier. Robert is a glass artist based in Vermont who has been working with glass since 1973.
Hello.
Hi.
Hey, how are you guys?
Great. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure.
All right. We're so excited to get to know you. Obviously, glass has been a big part of your life for a long time now, but maybe we can skip the glass part of you and tell us a little bit about where you live, what you enjoy besides glass, and then get us into your glass story.
Sure. Well, in 1993, I bought a farm in Vermont because I was really passionate about growing local agriculture. And we raise heritage beef, sheep, and organic vegetables, orchards, bees, maple syrup. So if it wasn't for glass, I'd be a full-time farmer. We moved to Vermont from New York City full-time in 97 and got involved with the farm and the community. I started a nonprofit that helps local agriculture in 2010 and on the board of the Townsend Historical Society and very active in the community.
Where did you live before Vermont? Did you always live in Vermont?
So I lived in New York City for 20 years and worked out of urban glass in New York City.
And is that where you picked up glass to start with?
No, I was fascinated with glass at a really, really early age. When I was 12 in 1967, my parents took us to the Montreal Expo, and I was just after the World Series, and my dad said, "We're getting in the car and we're going on a trip." And so we piled in the car, ended up in Montreal, freezing cold November week we were there. It was miserable. And we got into the expo, and there was a building that really sort of drew my attention. I had no idea why. And I made my parents wait 3.5 hours in line because I had a big temper tantrum. And it was the Czechoslovakian Pavilion. And when I got inside, I get goosebumps even talking about it now. It was just major Czech artists, monumental sculptures. So it was pretty unique. And so that was my start. So when I went to art school, I looked for art schools that had a glass department. So I finally chose Philadelphia College of Art to start my career. And it was, back in 1973, glass hadn't been really prevalent in a lot of the universities and colleges. And if it was, the studios were pretty basic. I mean, the glass studio at Philadelphia was a lean-to in the courtyard that rain would rain in on you when you're blowing, and always crack a piece right when you're in the middle of it. And when I got there and tried to register for the glass class, they said, "Oh no, that's only for seniors. That's only an elective for seniors. Unless you're a senior, you can't take that." And of course, during my interview and tour, they said, "Oh, absolutely, you can take glass." And that was the reason I went there. So I just kind of sat in the glass class about 4 weeks. The teacher was this guy named Roland Jan. And after about the 6th class, it was at 8 a.m. Half the seniors never showed up. And I was really interested in glass. And he eventually said, "Yeah, just bring me the damn paper and I'll get you in the class." So I was able to, as a freshman, start to learn glass blowing. So, and if it wasn't for that, insistence and I'll just sit here and watch. I don't care, And he really realized that I had a strong interest in glass. And that's why I came there. And luckily for him allowing me to do that, I've had an amazing long career in glass. So I stayed in Philadelphia for a couple of years, and they didn't have a glass major per se. The major was in three-dimensional design and sort of with a specialty in one of the crafts fields. So I did metalsmithing and ceramics, and then combined glass with both metal and ceramics. But it was small and limited access besides class to actually learn how to, practice and blow glass. And there'd been a lecturer that had come through Philadelphia College of Art named Tony Laws, and he was a silversmith to the Queen, basically, in England. And he was teaching at a couple different colleges in London. And I wrote to him and I said, any chance that I could come over? And they had a glass department there also. I had checked it out, come over and go to school there. And he said, sure, just come. So they didn't really have any formal application or whatever. So I showed up, and the college was called Hornsey College of Art. And it was a brand new campus that was built in Cockfosters outside of London. And it had weaving, furniture, industrial design, glass, silversmithing, and goldsmithing. And I think that was it. And the facility was amazing. And they had a totally different educational system than I was used to at Philadelphia. You were really learning how to make the material, make your objects, design your objects. And so I had my final show, and I had thought that I wanted to go to Royal College of Art. And in my final show, Joel Philip Myers, he had seen my thesis show and offered me a MFA position at Illinois State University in Normal, Bloomington, Illinois. And I knew that I wanted to come back to the States. So I went to Normal, Illinois, in the middle of the cornfields. And after working in, some really nice studios in London, the studio at Illinois was very basic. It was the golf cart shack on the golf course at the university. Garage doors opened up and the cold wind and snow blew in, and that was our only ventilation. And the studio was a great space to work because there was nothing else to do. And so I was really able to concentrate on my thesis and a few different bodies of work.
Can you verbalize what your thesis ended up becoming, like what the focus was of that? And then maybe can you tell us about how that was different from maybe the glass that you're making when you were abroad? Like, did your voice kind of change, or were you focusing on like one major style?
So yeah, my work has always been sort of inspired by nature and in some form or another. My early interest in glass, especially looking at the Czechoslovakian glass, was this sort of ideal of where 3 dimensions and 2 dimensions intersected, and the light in between those two, and what is reality and what is not reality. So a lot of the early works that I had done were very theatrical, large plates of glass that were 4 by 8 feet that had painted surfaces on them. And really, you're questioning what you're actually seeing. And is this a 3-dimensional object, or is it a graphic piece? And so it was that intersection of perception that really interested me. I had always been interested in sort of this linear pattern and this linear thought process. And I did a lot of knitting and weaving with copper wire. And my thesis, wasn't really in glass blowing. It was with, it was an MFA in sculpture using glass.
Cool. All right. Take us from there.
So I finished up at Illinois, and I wanted to move to New York City to become famous. And I guess as every artist does, I couldn't wait to get out of Illinois. And I had connections in New York City, which, looking back at it, they were so valuable in, again, that my whole career and my development in New York. When I arrived, this friend of mine, Peter G., who was a English painter, and he bought buildings and then renovated them. And he needed some help. He gave me a place to live, and I started sort of collaborating with him on some of these spaces. So that kind of continued, and Urban Glass was there. And, I started to book time there and do projects. And so the blowing aspect continued, as did my sort of infatuation with the larger scale installation work. And So I stayed in New York till 1999. And when I look back at it and think of some of the highlights of some of the projects that I did, it's very diverse. And it's interesting, the energy in the city and the inspiration from what's happening really, really tore me in a zillion different directions. One of the first editions of glass blowing that I did, I had a friend, Stephen Burlingham, who was Louis Comfort Tiffany's great grandson, and he wanted to launch a fragrance line. And he had the concept and the idea to call it Fravril, which was sort of the technique that was the iridized silvered glass that Tiffany had become so famous, his great grandfather had become so famous with at the turn of the century. And he wanted a limited edition, and how could we figure out how to do this and make it into a product that would fragrance wouldn't leak all over the place, and that could be produced fairly consistently. And so I worked, and I think we did an edition of 500 1-ounce perfume bottles in amazing Fravril glass, and then I consulted with a glass company and used some of those techniques to get some incredibly iridized glass bottles that each were unique, but they were done in a semi-automatic fashion. And that collection was about to launch, and then Tiffany and Company, who had been bought numerous times, decided to sue him and say that he could not launch a fragrance using his heritage as the great grandson of Louis Comfort Tiffany. And so he fought it for 2 years. He finally won, used up all his money fighting it, and then didn't really have any money to launch the project. So looking back, that was like a really interesting project that I had never really been a production glass blower and or thought that I could do it to make 500 pieces the same. And then in the end, I believe it ended up that we never got paid for the job because the whole thing went up bust. And so it was a huge learning experience, which was kind of crazy. And then in 1984, I was asked to consult on the flame for the Statue of Liberty. And the existing flame came over as a polished copper version that Bartholdi, the sculptor, had designed. And when it finally made it and got constructed on the island, he came up like 6 months later in a boat coming up the Hudson River and realized that the polished copper had all started to patina green. And he had written in his notebook, wow, maybe we should have gold leafed the sculpture. So time-wise. So in 1906, they got electricity on the island, and they cut round portholes in the copper flame and put a light inside. So it became a beacon, a torch. And then in 1917, I think they got a lot more electricity. And so they ripped all the copper away and left the steel armature that the copper was bolted to, and stained glassed it. So they slumped these large stained glass panels, which by the 50s was leaking like a sieve, and her arm was going to fall off because it had rusted so bad. And so, when they were doing the restoration, the flame was something that had been bastardized, wasn't the original flame from the statue that the artist had intended. And they had asked, if we could look at it and to figure out if we could do it so it would never leak again. And the most obvious thing was to do a solid hollow casting of the flame. And it was 12 foot from tip to toe. So it would have been a massive casting. And I was working with Corning at the time on the project, similar to like the Hubble telescope they had cast. And we calculated the weight of the glass being 40 tons. Which her arm certainly couldn't hold that. And so one of the architects had found the journal and talked with the museum curator. And they had said that, the story about him coming up the river and thinking that it should have been gold leafed. So that was brought back to the committee and said, why don't we go back to the original copper version and then have it gold leafed? So since I was heavily into the project, had been to the museum, done research, I collected a whole series of photographs of what the flame had looked like. The flame in the arm was brought over, I think, in 1876 to the Philadelphia exhibition and was put on display. And then there were some photographs from his studio outside of Paris. And so from those images, we modeled the original flame again from the photographs. And then a company called Métiers du Champenois came over from France. They built a little atelier right on the island, did all the wooden forms and did the copper repoussé work, very much like Art Bartoli had originally done it. They completed the copper flame from the 1/12 scale model that I did, and then gold leafed it, and then had a helicopter bring it up and fix it to her. And so there's exterior lighting around the flame. So at night it glows beautifully, and then it glows beautifully during the daytime. And so, it's so funny how in the city, one project would lead into another project. From that, there was press that I had received, and somebody from MTV had contacted me. And so MTV was really young at the time. They had already designed the Moon Man Award for the VMAs, and they had a new category that was the Breakthrough Video Award. And they, since I worked on a famous icon, they said, why don't we get Robert to design it? So we worked and designed this. And again, it's so funny because it was basically a television set on steroids, and that had all these fractured pieces of mirrored glass with inside the frame. So as you looked at it, you got reflected in many different ways. Again, back to some of the sculptural pieces that I had worked on previously. And then, MTV's been a lifelong client. This is from then. In 1991, I designed the Nickelodeon Kids' Choice Awards. We've done over 2,000 of those awards. And again, that whole interest in glass inside it, there's a kaleidoscope. And, it was sort of the kids' view of the world. When they asked me to design it, they wanted an icon. They wanted something that kids could be proud of, and that it was playful. So for the best movie star, it would be something that would show the kid in them. And it's become, a huge icon. And from there, I've designed a zillion awards, from the ESPYs to the Country Music Television Awards to the MTV Movie Awards, the popcorn. And that became an interesting business because they keep coming back every year. And so it's something you would put a lot of time and energy in designing the icon and then making it. But then every year in March, I got to make 35 more Kids' Choice Awards, which was good income-wise. It kept me, independent. It kept me never working for anyone. So I've always only worked for myself. And, as the time progressed, I had numerous shows around the country to Cordova Museum. And these are the larger scale installations with sheet glass. One of my first shows, they were in the basement of the Guggenheim downtown. And in 1995, I did a big installation there, which was basically a beach filled with sand, with my hermit crab project, which had been sparked by a trip we had down in Abaco. Across my blanket was walking this hermit crab, and it kind of looked a little bit odd. And when I picked it up, it was living in the broken neck of a Coke bottle. And it was like, oh my God, I can make a better home than a broken neck of a Coke bottle. And so when I got back up to the studio, that was it was in my head. It was just like, it was there and just churning. And again, I was blowing glass weekly at Urban Glass. And I had another award to design for the World Wildlife Federation. And they always awarded some noble person who gave millions of dollars for some cause. And so I was working on that award, and they were based out of the Coney Island Aquarium, the curator. And she had come to my studio, and I had an installation of these living apple trees that I had adorned with and woven with glass objects. And the pieces grew over time. So it would take 10 years for the wood and the glass to grow together, and then those would be harvested off. And one tree, I had these sort of shell shapes on it. And the woman said, oh my God, she said, somebody brought in from Coney Island Beach a hermit crab that was living in the broken neck of a Coke bottle. And I was like, oh my God, this must be a sign. And she goes, those remind me of it. They would make a great home for a hermit crab. And so I started experimenting, making these glass shells and trying to figure out how to make a glass shell with a spiral that would really mimic nature, that would allow a hermit crab to actually inhabit, which kind of blew my mind, if I could achieve that. And so after 6 months, I had a plethora of shells. I got some live hermit crabs and made this environment for them, and no one would move in. And it's like, what the hell am I doing wrong? There's something is up here. And so I took some of the natural shells and I cut them in half. And I realized I was blowing the spiral in the wrong direction. So 97% of hermit crabs have a right-handed spiral, and I had a left-handed spiral in all the shells. It was just sort of the natural way I blew it. I'm a little bit embarrassed that it took me 6 months to figure out that the spiral was going in the wrong direction. And then, so once I did that, ploop, they moved in. And it was just this sort of epiphany of, here we go to the beach, we collect these beautiful shells, we fill our bathrooms with them. And it's a habitat for other animals. And I kind of wanted to make it sort of an educational piece. And when I did the show at the Guggenheim, I was hoping that sort of educational aspect would really come out. And then I realized it was a huge hermit crab pet market, and everyone wanted to buy one of my glass shells for their pets. So, I started producing glass shells and sold it on glassshell.com. And to this day, I'm still fascinated with the hermit crabs.
I have a question about the process that you're making these awards. Do you find that you're able to naturally come to like an agreement with all your customers on what the awards are going to look like? Or is that a process where like you as an artist come up with the design and then you have to communicate and kind of end up with an agreement?
Yes. So I think the reason that, the clients have chosen me has been because an award is really an icon and becomes an icon from a company. And I had the innate ability to come up with icons that have been around now for 20 and 30 years. So they will say, like with the Kids' Choice Award, we need something fun. Here's our logo sheets for Nickelodeon. So they had like 2,000 of these images, and the blimp was on one of them. And so the inspiration came from one of the little graphic blimps that Nickelodeon had on it. And, the whole idea of, I don't know where the idea of the kaleidoscope came from, but that, came out of the blue. So it's a combination. The first MTV Movie Award we worked on, the art director that I was working with, he wanted something to do with a 16 millimeter reel. And so we made this interactive reel. Instead of having film in it, there were circular pieces of plexiglass that had various images that were on them. And as you spun them, they changed color. And again, it was that kind of that whole kaleidoscope idea, which was carried over to the blimp and the earlier award I did for the Breakthrough Video Award. And it just didn't show up well. We did 1 or 2 years, it just didn't show up well. And they came back to me and said, why don't, let's think of something else. And so, to me, what's the icon when you go to the movies is popcorn. So the thought of doing something that was a little cheeky, that was actually made out of a real paper popcorn cup, but then glitzed up with, with cast gold and stuff. So yeah, it just sort of happened and they loved it. So it's always been a collaboration between the different clients. The Country Music Television Award, this was one this is a bronze buckle. So the buckle actually comes off so the winner can wear it. And it says underneath, in use or something. And that's the Buckle Award. And again, this was another thing that I mean, what's more country than a belt buckle, So the ability to come up with some concepts and I think that the background in three-dimensional design, the aspect of absolutely enjoy, that whole aspect has, just fascinated me. And that aspect of, is it art? Is it design? And that's something that I've freely flowed in and out of. It really helped pay the bills.
I really wanted to talk a little bit about like where you are today. I know that you went through some like terrible things with a fire not that long ago, but then that started a whole new series that you've been working on. And I thought that was really interesting. I was hoping that we could touch upon that a
Sure.
little.
I had a disaster at the farm in 2015. Our dog started barking in the middle of the night, and my wife woke up and looked out the window and she said, "Wow, what a beautiful sunrise." And then looked at the clock, and it was 3 o'clock in the morning when the sun doesn't come up. And our barn was engulfed with flames, 40-foot flames. It was a 4-story historic barn built in 1810. And it's separate than the glass studio. And, it perished. And I love barns, and I loved the collection of stuff that I had in the barn. I mean, it was used for animals, but it was, filled with, hundreds of years worth of tools and farm equipment. And so the next day when an excavator came, started, pulling apart everything that landed on it was a 4-story barn. So everything that was on the concrete slab started going in the dumpster. And I remember them picking up this shovel, which was my absolute favorite shovel. And I just said, "Stop, that's my favorite shovel." and I just, it was no sleep that night. And so I just started going through the rubble and making this massive pile of things that had meaning to me. And I had no idea why. Some of them I knew why. I mean, we had these 50 beautiful kerosene oil lanterns that I had at my wedding in 1995. And they were crushed and manipulated and just, massacred. And so I just started bringing some stuff to the studio. And what was interesting was that I said, I'm just going to play with these. So I remember the lanterns were some of the first objects that I played with. And just very guttural, just pouring glass over them with almost the concept that, there was a glass object in the barn that had melted and had fused to the lanterns. So it was sort of cause and effect, and again capturing a moment in time that froze solid. So I expected that the first day I did like I cast 5 or 6 pieces, and I expected to open the annealing oven and they would all be shattered. And when I opened it up, they were in one piece. It's like, what the hell? This is like, and I've worked with glass and metal in so many different forms. And, part of that exploding was sort of anger too, that I was hoping that it would come out, but they were beautiful. And so I continued. And then it wasn't till, I don't know, like 15 or 20 pieces that I had worked with, they had all survived. And it was like, wow, this is so bizarre. And I started thinking, why, why did they survive? Because, metal contracts more than glass, and they would always shear. And I realized that I never dusted any of these things off, and they were filled with carbon from the fire. And so I discovered that carbon coating, i.e. like a graphite coating, allowed each of the pieces to never bond and shrink separately. So we didn't have any exploding. So that was like an amazing thing. And then the names of the pieces, really, I wanted it to be a fun collection, so the collection of lanterns, it was called Lights Out. They were just, it was very humorous and really got over the whole trauma and working. It was like, it was my psychotherapist was making these pieces, and it's fun.
I was wondering, with all of the work that you've done, and it seems so vast and different, how do you ever not feel motivated or inspired?
Never, ever, never. That's not a possibility. That is just like, it's totally, one thing flows into another. I have sketchbooks filled with ideas for 5 different lifetimes. So that's absolutely never been a problem. Both with the inspiration from my farm. I've done a huge series with honeybees, blowing glass objects and inserting them into my hives. And then the bees are encasing them in wax and honey. And those pieces become the final objects to, I have an orchard at the farm that has been growing glass objects since 1995.
How do you figure out how to price things when it's your whole lifetime worth of thought and time and experience? And even for some of these projects, it takes years before they're finished. Are you able to like really figure out what you need to live off of and be comfortable with it? Or
No, I've always been, I've always had income from projects, like the award business that comes back every year. So with my own sculpture work, I never really had to worry. So that was a huge advantage. And then some of the really larger architectural chandelier projects that are hundreds of thousands of dollars and they're all over the world, those sometimes a client will have a budget that's, whatever, it's 25 feet wide and 15 feet deep. Can you do it? And somehow you figure out a way that you can do it and still have some profit left over for yourself.
so if you had like do you have something that you would like to say as a conclusion? No pressure, but some kind of advice or like a life perspective to pass on or some happy words of wisdom.
Yeah, I think one of the thing that has kept me going and kept me interested is just being passionate about something. And if you can find that inner passion, even though, I remember my parents saying, oh, you're going to be an artist. Luckily, we have, your older brother's a scientist and he's going to make something of his life. And, hearing that your whole life and then kind of being the one that's been the successful person. And it's been the successful person because I've really followed my passion. So that advice is just, love what you do. You want to get up every day and do it. I'll, be blowing glass and working with glass the rest of my life in some form or another. And yeah, just, the passion that comes out, whether I'm farming or whether I'm blowing glass or teaching.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode of Connected in Glass. Make sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram for more information on the artists we interview and for updates on the podcast.